Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques. There are two sorts of events humans cannot comprehend easily. The events that took millions of years to produce results, and catastrophes that can change everything in a matter of minutes or seconds. Because they are made to last only 100 years or so, humans are uncomfortable with the proven fact that their families are between 3 and 4 billion years old. On the other hand, humans like so much their daily routine that they refuse to admit that the coming economic crisis could brutally put an end to their comfortable way of living. Nowadays, things go so fast that the prehistoric animals we still are unable to adapt to a world where the quantity and the size of the catastrophes keep increasing on a planet that is no longer able to clean the environmental mess we created during the last centuries. If planet Earth is a comfortable oasis in the middle of a dark, cold and dead universe, it is because for billions of years evolution has produced millions of species that used to absorb so much energy that very little remained to produce catastrophes. Humans came so late in the history of our life form that they ended up believing that the planet was indestructible and could absorb all the pollution they could produce. Even the invention of agriculture, which destroyed so many natural ecosystems, didn't change that mentality. Okay, it's true that for 10 or 12,000 years our agricultural societies did copy the cyclical nature of the living world. Our technologies were then so primitive that they couldn't destroy the tropical forests, the poles, or the bottom of the oceans, all places that were out of reach anyway. The main difference between a natural ecosystem and those cyclical agricultural societies was that humans were replacing the predators, the prey, and the parasites of the natural world. In those societies, the most violent humans were the predators, the farmers and the craftsmen were the prey, while the soldiers, the beggars, and the burglars were the parasites. If the farmers and the craftsmen accepted to be dominated and exploited by the nobles, it was because they needed the protection they provided to produce wealth. Of course, when they felt overexploited, the working classes could revolt. But it is striking that despite all the revolution registered by historians, none has changed the way mankind was governed. In fact, throughout history, mankind has known only one form of government. Everywhere, an oligarchy chose a leader whose task was to govern the entire society with the tacit approval of a large part of the population. Monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and dictatorship were only variants of that system. In nature, there are other forms of government. For instance, social insects are ruled by a queen who uses hormones to give orders to the workers. Among the elephants, a matriarch leads the tribe. Among the gorillas, a dominant male is the boss, etc. Something interesting, historians have discovered that the different variants of the human governing system have a strong tendency to follow a kind of cycle. For instance, democracy tends to evolve towards demagogy, because those who succeed in a democratic system are those who make the most generous promises to the voters. Since everybody tries to extract as much wealth as possible from the state without paying taxes, all sorts of deficits soon appear in a democratic society, a situation that creates a social chaos which is often solved by a dictator who is called to restore order. It's so true that the only historical law that is considered totally valid by historians is that anarchy always leads to a dictatorship. A good example of it has been given by the Athenian democracy more than 2,000 years ago. If the Athenian middle class were then allowed to vote, it was essentially because they were the armed defenders of the city. If that democracy degenerated afterwards, it was because the Athenians had become so rich for so long that they became decadent. Here is a second historical law that is almost always true. When a human group has been rich for some generations, its members become lazy. They stop having enough kids to replace the population, and they overindulge in food, alcohol, and drugs. As a result, their nation becomes so weak that the dictator can easily submit it. That's precisely what happened in Greece with Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. It goes without saying that dictators, and especially their descendants, often degenerate and become decadent after a few decades. If dictatorships tend to last longer than democracies, it's because wealth and pleasures affect so few people in such a system that a simple change of dynasty is normally sufficient to solve the problem. There is also the fact that monarchy is well adapted to the agricultural world that dominated on the planet for more than 10,000 years. In the past, it sometimes happened that a return to democracy was caused by a series of technical innovations that gave the power to a new social class. It happened at the end of the Middle Ages in Europe when maritime regions like northern Germany, Italy, or Flanders became dominated by city-states governed by merchants who made money by constantly improving the technologies they used. The Cultural Revolution launched by those merchants would be called the Renaissance. By bringing back in Europe all the knowledge accumulated by all the other civilizations, the Italian merchants in particular made possible the development of science that would one day conquer the whole world. One of the results of that scientific revolution has been to make the European middle classes richer, which allowed them to conquer the power through violent revolutions or through a slow evolution of old institutions, like in England. The Industrial Revolution, which has been a consequence of the Renaissance, reinforced that evolution towards more democracy by making the middle classes indispensable. Unfortunately, wealth, here again, had the same negative effects on humans, especially in the Western world after the Second World War. The present decline of the Western world is so important that we sometimes have the impression that it will soon be replaced by an older but less corrupt civilization. The only problem with such an idea is that it is false. Why? Because the industrialization of the entire planet has created a situation totally new. For the first time in human history, we are witnessing the collapse of the natural environments that produce the air, the drinking water, and the food humans do consume. From now onward, history will no longer be made of a succession of civilizations or nations that will replace one another. No. In the future, all mankind will suffer from the present environmental collapse. And this is despite the fact that some regions will suffer much less than others. Of course, it's not because history is about to change its course that humans have perceived or accepted it. Nowadays, all the nations of the world refuse to reduce their standard of living. Westerners, who were the first to benefit from the Industrial Revolution, actually believe that their wasteful way of living is protected by their constitutions, their charters of rights, or their pension plan, without realizing that those documents are nothing more than a pile of paper. In the developing world, people dreamt for so long to live the American dream that they don't listen to those who tell them they must reduce their consumption to save the planet. Quite the opposite. China and India, where pollution is a major problem, do everything they can to increase their spending and their economic growth. The Muslims actually believe that their descendants will conquer the world, despite the fact that their birth rate is falling like a rock. All over the world, our political leaders are so overwhelmed by the size of the crisis that they don't know what to do. As a result, they take hasty decisions without thinking about their long-term consequences. We saw it in Europe during the migrant crisis of 2015, when politicians tried to replace millions of Western retirees by uneducated migrants who ended up on welfare or on the street. Those short-sighted decisions are typical of politicians who for decades worked very hard to get elected and who did nothing to solve the long-term problems of their country. Problems like the fertility decline, the regular national budget deficits they themselves created, or the growing debt load of the population. For them, the solution to that kind of problems was always to sacrifice the future by printing an ever-growing quantity of money, which means growing the national debt, or by delaying as much as possible the most essential infrastructure repair. If those tricks didn't produce an economic depression yet, it is essentially because the financiers who control our central banks, our economies, and our politicians have maintained the interest rates artificially low, which allowed our governments and the speculators to maintain an artificial economic growth by borrowing money that cost next to nothing. As you can see on this graph, the US interest rate has been maintained close to zero since 2001. The only exception being between 2005 and 2008, when the bankers let the rate go up to 5%, which triggered the subprime crisis that almost collapsed the world economy. To solve that crisis, the central bankers simply brought back the interest rate to almost 0%. Since the best way to reduce inflation is to raise the interest rates, the bankers, the politicians, and their friends have been using tricks for years to hide the real inflation rate. For instance, manufacturers have started to reduce the size of their products without changing their prices. This is called shrinkflation. Such tactics gave rich people enough time to hide their money in tax havens scattered all over the world. In 2016, however, the inflation became so strong that the central banks started to hike the interest rates, but as slowly as possible. It goes without saying that when the population will finally realize that inflation is much higher than what is reported in the media, most people will refuse to lend money without receiving a much higher interest rates than that. To avoid the total disappearance of cash, the central banks will then be forced to hike the official interest rates to maybe 10–15% or more, which will make impossible the repayment of our mountains of public and private debts. To pay their employees, the police, and their armies, our bankrupt governments will be forced to print money like crazy, which will create an hyperinflation and launch a profound and insoluble economic crisis. Since their salaries and their pensions will rapidly lose most of their values, the poorest of the poor will suffer so much that they will almost certainly become as violent as the Venezuelan rioters. Anarchy will ensue, especially in the countries where the governments have already lost the control on many parts of their territory. It will be the case in Europe, where foreign extremists have created towns and ghettos where the native population is not allowed to go. On top of that, we recently saw in the streets of the Western world a group of masked bandits who brutalized their political opponents. When the situation becomes that chaotic in a country, the population stops believing in the system or in the elected politicians and starts following any leader who promises to use very simple solutions to tackle very complex problems. This is why, in a very deep crisis, politicians are rapidly and brutally replaced by a wave of great men who come from nowhere to seize the power. The French, the American, and the Bolshevik revolutions were good examples of that. It's important to understand that a dictator is never alone. Most of the time, he is the survivor and the winner of a long and violent political struggle inside a group of revolutionaries. Napoleon was a good example of that. To take the power, that group can stage a coup d'etat or try to establish its legitimacy by winning a regular election. That second solution is more advantageous because it allows to hide the new dictatorship under a false democratic veneer. That's what Vladimir Putin did in Russia. Normally, a coup d'etat is easy to stage in a country where the rule of law is no longer respected because the population has lost faith in the political system. When there is anarchy in the streets and when nobody knows who's really in charge, the armed forces, the police, the civil servants, and the state itself stop functioning properly. As a result, a small armed group can easily seize the power. It is done by capturing the members of the former government, by occupying the most important strategic points in the capital, by taking the control of all the radio and television stations, and by imposing a curfew. All that to impede any counterattack. That being done, the putschists normally try to capture as many political opponents as possible, and they use enough violence to bring back order and force everybody to go back to work, which reassure those who like order, for instance, the police and the civil servants. Politically, the first thing dictators do after seizing the power is to get rid of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protect us all. On the economic front, they try to stabilize the situation by banning all unauthorized private exchanges with other countries or, in our case, by canceling the national debts. Of course, measures like that will not change the fact that this time mankind will have to reduce the size of the world economy in order to save our dying planet. In most countries, governments will do as usual in a crisis and will sacrifice the poorest and the weakest in order to save the specialists who do know how to keep a modern society running. To keep those technicians under control, the governments could very well isolate them by shutting down the internet or by limiting internet access to a certain territory or to certain users. That's what North Korea is doing. or by using it to find terrorists or political opponents. This being said, it is doubtful that the 21st century will see the constitution of very large empires. Why? Because the atomic bomb is such an effective defensive weapon that for the time being, tiny countries like Israel and North Korea are almost impossible to conquer. It's hard to imagine how mankind will solve that particular problem. We'll talk about it in a future video. I thank you in advance to share this video on the internet. This video is the 16th of a group of videos I made on the coming economic depression. The list of those videos will appear on the screen in the coming second, as well as the book I wrote on geopolitics. Unfortunately, for the time being, this book is still in French. See you next time.